Hi, this is Charles Hoskinson, broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. Always warm, always sunny, sometimes Colorado. Today is December 20th, 2023. We're getting dangerously close to Christmas. Fun, happy Christmas. And I wish all of you a Merry Christmas. And it's been a long, stressful, very exhausting year. But it's also been a really remarkable year and a fun year. And I've truly enjoyed, going to Dubai and hanging out with you people, hanging out with all of the interesting people throughout the world. Went everywhere from Mongolia to Louisiana and between. And it's just been fun. And it's been cool to see the diverse sets of opinions, cultures, languages, and ultimately to get to know all your hopes and dreams and try to be part of them where and when that makes sense. But anyway, I want to make a quick video about a passion of mine. I'm a big fan of formal systems and formal languages. Many of you know we do formal methods at Input Output, and I also studied mathematics a long time ago in a different life. And the first thing you learn when you study mathematics, especially at higher levels, is this concept of formal systems. So you have a concept of axioms and truth that flows from axioms. And a big part of the foundations of mathematics is this kind of four different areas. One is this idea of consistency and completeness. So you want your axioms to be consistent, meaning they don't contradict each other. You want them to be complete in that all the things that you would want to say, you can say inside that system. You want them to be independent of each other, meaning that you don't derive one axiom from another, but they're truly independent. This was a big thing with Euclid's parallel postulate, for example. And then also you want them to be decidable, meaning that if you have some arbitrary decision, you can get to that from a series of derivations inside the system. Turns out that mathematics is actually neither complete, we have Kurt Gödel to thank for that, or decidable. We have Alan Turing to thank for that. And this actually led to the birth of computer science. Turing's paper, he used Turing machines not to invent computers, but Turing machines actually prove that math is not decidable. And then that led to the foundations of modern computer science. So formal systems are super cool to study because not all formal systems are incomplete and undecidable. Some formal systems, like Hilbert's representation of geometry, are complete. And you can decide all the things that you want to mechanistically. It leads to a lot of really cool concepts. Now, constitutional law is interesting. We at Cardano Land have to deal with this because we're writing a constitution for Cardano. And the question is, how much of that constitution needs to be machine understandable and self-consistent, have appropriately large set of axioms inside of it. They're, call them amendments or sections, whatever you want to. And ultimately, how much of that constitution is ambiguous and left to human judgment. So something recently happened in the United States, and this is almost like the political Rorschach test. So if you're a Republican, it's an outrage and wrong. If you're a Democrat, oh, it's completely legitimate interpretation of the Constitution. And it's Trump being barred from the ballot in the state of Colorado. So the Supreme Court of the United States was petitioned by a partisan group to Supreme Court of Colorado, I should say. Every state in the United States has its own Supreme Court, and then the United States has a federal Supreme Court. But the state Supreme Court looked at the 14th Amendment, and an argument was made that Trump committed insurrection, and therefore he is ineligible to be on the ballot in the state of Colorado. Now, many people say, well, we've read the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment says it doesn't say anything about a conviction or a standard, these things. And this is a classic example of first Dunning-Kruger, but more importantly, it's a classical example of not thinking about a document in its totality. Constitutional interpretation and constitutional analysis is a very hard thing because the Constitution was not written in a completely decidable, complete, unambiguous way, where an answer to something is like a well-formed formula being reduced and reduced until it hits an axiom and you can derive a truth value. Instead, there are all kinds of ebbs and flows in different schools of how one would want to interpret it. There's this originalist textualist view that was most famously brought to light by Antonin Scalia and people from those kind of houses, where it says, hey, we're going to really try to get into the head of the original intent of the writers and try to apply as close to a high fidelity interpretation at that time. So the Second Amendment is an example. It was written by people who just got done having a revolution that was only possible by having guns. And this concept that the government needs to give you the right to have your own military is kind of pretty crazy to a bunch of revolutionaries. They liked the idea of a well-armed population. And he wrote about this in the Federalist Papers and related documents. So the people at the time really believed a well-armed group of people was essential for a republic to exist, because it prevented a tyrannical government from causing problems for the people. Now, a living interpretation of that document would say things like, well, hang on a second here. There's a world of difference between a musket that you have to load with people who grew up in an agricultural society and an AR-15 that can be modified to become fully automatic and kill hundreds of people, or a tank, or in my case, a Black Hawk helicopter. So this obviously, there's some wiggle room here, and depending upon where your legal philosophy sits, you can have a disagreement over how one ought to interpret and build a framework around the Second Amendment. It's very similar with freedom of speech. An absolute interpretation would seem to suggest you can say anything regardless of the consequences. You can yell fire in a theater, cause a panic, and kill a bunch of people. Well, over 200 years of constitutional interpretation has worked its way through. There's a lot of case law, and there's a lot of common notions and debates that have become somewhat settled. So a great example would be when constitutional amendments seem to contradict each other. For example, the 14th Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. Fifth Amendment has this concept that you can't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. The 14th Amendment doesn't seem to create a due process test for depriving you of a right. Normally, how a constitutional scholar would examine these things would say, well, is there a way to make the amendments compatible with each other, even if it's not explicit? So there's kind of three different things you can do to generate a notion of due process, a test. One is a political process. You've been removed from office, so an impeachment has occurred, and then you've been removed by the higher house, so the president's been removed, but there's a judicial oversight there. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over that trial. And it seems that there's been a due process, and no one can argue that was not an exhaustive bipartisan effort given the high barrier to removal, which was one of the arguments of the second impeachment of Trump. There's a judicial standard. Turns out that actually in the US Code, there is a standard for insurrection, and you can violate it and be convicted of it in a court of law, which would certainly meet the Fifth Amendment standard. And then there's a personal process, which is what the Confederacy did, where agents of the US government left the US government. They gave formal notice that they're pulling out of the government and joining an organization at war with the United States government. Any reasonable person would view such an action done in public as some form of process. We can argue what level of thresholds need to be there for insurrection, and typically what would happen is a court would construct a test. And the goal is objectivity of that test, meaning it's equally applied to all people. You have to have equal application of these things to stay compatible with other amendments. Now, so this is not easy. And as you can see, there's big political differences, but you have to understand that these things are always taken in a broader context. And it's very relevant for us in the Cardano ecosystem, especially as we move from negative rights, things that restrict what the protocol can do or a government can do. For example, freedom of speech and freedom of religion doesn't give you freedom of religion, freedom of speech. There's this concept that it's naturally yours, and it restricts the US government from interfering in those things. Okay? It's very important to understand that nuance. You are not given rights in a constitution. Negative rights in the US Constitution, in particular, are there to prevent the government from violating rights you already have and are born with. And this was a big innovation in the writing of the US Constitution. So analogously, when you look at Cardano Constitution, there's a broader conversation of, okay, well, what's a negative right versus what is a punitive measure to restrict a right. Under what circumstances can the network do something? For example, in this case with Trump, they're disqualifying him from a God-given right he has, the right to this liberty right to run. Republic requires people to be able to run the government and run for office. Okay, and to disqualify him, you kind of need to have some notion of due process for that. Evidence has to be presented for that. He's innocent until proven guilty. So what does he have to do? Sue the government for the government to then to establish innocence? It doesn't really make sense. It's backwards. So it's obviously something that will, with the Supreme Court of the United States, be overturned because it's a humongous judicial overreach. But it does beg an interesting question of how do you find these intersections? Because there are clear co-equal branches of government. There's the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And this is one of those strange things where all three branches can sometimes be involved in things, and definitions are not clear. If we're going to write a good constitution, we have to get rid of as much ambiguity as possible. So I always try to make these videos somewhat educational, and what I try to do is recommend a little bit of self-education. And there's two resources I'd highly recommend that you take a look at if you have the time. One's from Princeton University, and it's their course on constitutional interpretation. And it's about 7 weeks. It's not too long, and it's taught by a great professor, Robert George. And basically what this course covers is the alternative approaches in interpreting the Constitution, a historical development of the powers of judicial review, the question of judicial supremacy in relation to the Congress and the president. There's some wiggle room there, relations between the federal government of delegated and enumerated powers, and the role of courts in securing freedoms of religion, speech, and rights of property. So it's really cool intuition pump to show you how remarkably nuanced and interesting this topic happens to be. And probably the gold standard in starting from legal interpretation. This is a book written by an incredibly brilliant legal mind, very controversial mind. But many lawyers say if you really want to learn how to write law and understand law, read Scalia, because he was so rigorous and so careful. But he has this lovely book, Reading Law, the Interpretation of Legal Texts. And I'd highly, highly recommend picking up a copy of this if you really want to take the time and spend the exercise and get well-versed on this. And you can systematically go about trying to build a system of interpretation for Constitution. And your system may actually be different from how the current Supreme Court of the United States views it. Or former Supreme Courts, but at the very least you have an informed opinion on these types of rights. And there's always a tension with lawmakers and judges over how we should handle these things. One of the cool things, though, is that this is not an academic question. It's a question that's relevant to us as an ecosystem because we are custodians now of documents which will define what does it mean to be an ADA holder, a participant in the Cardano ecosystem, the guardrails of the governance of that ecosystem, what that government can and can't do, especially with common goods like the treasury of Cardano. But then also it affects the political process of the United States, and we should ask some very foundational questions. Do we feel comfortable with the Fifth Amendment being violated by another amendment? Or should we try to make them interoperable with each other? To deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process is pretty antithetical to the entire bedrock of innocent until proven guilty and the rule of law. That's unambiguous. And we wake up every day and it's so ingrained into our bones that we seem to think that that's just an axiom that everybody's going to follow. But then when you have another amendment that exists and they say, well, we actually don't have to have that standard anymore. We can just, even though you've never been convicted and you're technically innocent until proven guilty, we, through some other process, which is unclear and not objective, just arbitrarily decide to remove a right that you have, that's something you're eligible for, is an extraordinary thing, which is why it's so pervasively dangerous. And just as a thought experiment, aiding and giving comfort to insurrectionists, well, there was a series of protests in the United States in 2020, and some of the protesters decided to secede from the United States. and create their own special economic zone that they say wasn't subject to U.S. law or part of the United States. They called it Chaz and other things. Now, it was a bit farcical, but a draconian interpretation of that could equate that to someone leaving the Union and doing the exact same things the Confederates did. And then any person who philosophically supports that movement, since we have no standards anymore, could be accused of aiding and abetting those people and therefore ineligible for office. You say, well, that's preposterous. You have to prove it. Well, actually, you don't. If you take the strict interpretation of the 14th Amendment, there's no evidence required or proof required, just the accusation without conviction is sufficient. A political investigation that does not result in a conviction is not due process. There was a trial in the legislative branch. The trial was inconclusive, did not result in conviction. There are ongoing trials that you can infer are insurrection, and there's a very high probability, actually, Trump will be convicted of at least one of these. And then you can infer from that conviction due process has been held, and thus they've committed insurrection and no longer eligible. But is the mere accusation of something sufficient to disqualify someone? Doesn't that seem in spirit to violate some foundational constitutional principles we have? And wouldn't a fair and reasonable court try to make these things compatible with each other instead of allowing an inconsistency to exist? We've been down this road before. In fact, in the late 19th century, there was this court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And it invented out of thin air something that wasn't in the Constitution, this concept of separate but equal, which was the bedrock of much legislation in the Deep South that allowed the segregation of races in the South and systemic racism to be put in the law for decades. This was never the intent of the people who wrote the Constitution, especially the amendments after the Civil War. If they wanted to create a separate but equal standard, they absolutely could have done so. But it was invented by racist judges and had to be removed and overturned decades later, but only after catastrophic consequences. And this is in the inherent danger of legislating from the bench, and this is the inherent danger of not trying to connect the amendments to each other and really think through the consequences of inventing out of thin air random standards which have no judicial backbone oversight or legislative backbone or oversight. So we as an ecosystem, we have to make sure within our scope of affairs, because we're not really talking at the moment about life, but we are talking about liberty and property. Your ADA, under what circumstances can you lose it? And can it come back? Can it transaction be frozen or reversed? Currently, that's not possible in the system. If you'd like that to be a constitutional right, a negative right, we can certainly put that in, and that should be debated and discussed from a constitutional viewpoint. Under what circumstances can your liberty be violated? Let's say privacy-preserving primitives are put into the system. Well, are there escrow keys? Are there ways to de-anonymize things as the majority of the network comes together for that? There are certainly ways to construct a system that have those properties. Currently, they do not exist in Cardano. You see where this is going? So the analogies of real life, of what's happening in the political process, port over into the constructed world that we have. And it's super important that we stay up to date and we have an opinion. And the two resources I gave you will really prime and pump and supercharge your way of thinking about them. At the very least, give you a more analytical way of doing things. What's happened in the United States of America is this unfortunate chaos and partisanship where we abandon our principles and first principle thinking in exchange for teams. So suddenly due process doesn't matter because Orange Man bad. Suddenly it's okay to arrest your political opponents because Orange Man bad. And you know what? It'll happen on the other side. And we're not naive enough to believe that this is a Democrat thing. When the Republicans get back into full power, which will happen, if not 2024 and 2028 or beyond, the full weight of the federal government will be used to persecute every single political opponent, because now the norms are pretty well established. Special prosecutors could be assigned at any given time. Institutions like the FBI and the DOJ can become highly politicized. And there's really no checks and balances to stop this anymore. And they'll say, well, you did it to us, so we can do it to you. And you say, well, that's not fair. Well, you didn't cry out when it happened on the other side. Oh, well, that was completely justified. All right, well, the world's watching. And they see that the person running, who's leading the polls, has been arrested by the current president. That's what happens in banana republics. It's not really what's supposed to happen in a well-established constitutional republic that kind of got the whole thing started on liberty. We have 200 years of norms that have been thrown away. So these things, they don't live in a vacuum. They live in a broader context, and they infiltrate every single thing we do. And if your opinion is your ownership of ADA is not a universal objective thing, but it's contextual to who you are, and if I politically agree with you or not, we're going to run into a lot of problems as an ecosystem. Just like if your application of the law is based upon your politics, your belief, or your personal comfort or distaste for somebody, then we're in a very bad state. So this is just a great example. It's the first time in my life that I've seen a court apply a standard where they can deprive somebody of a right that they're born with, the right to represent, lead, once they meet a certain suitability, without due process. And that's just wholesale accepted by an entire political party. It's wrong. It's universally wrong, regardless of the person. And there's no objective way without due process that you could apply such a standard to any individual under any context. Okay? And that's just where we're at. And obviously, it's going to have to be corrected. When it's corrected, the court that corrects it will be accused of being partisan. And all the headlines that are going to be run is the 3 Supreme Court justices who were appointed by Trump were back their guy. That's the headline, not the, hey, we corrected a very significant, very, very serious constitutional breach. So we have to be better. Now, from our part at Intersect, one of the things we have is a civics committee. If you're interested in these things, do join that, join Intersect. And actually, the algorithmic representation of law is an ongoing project. And one of our goals in 2024 is going to be developing a domain-specific language to represent law in an unambiguous way. And I'll leave you with a conlang called Lojban, which many of you have not heard of, but it is one of my favorite languages, and it's a constructed language that was created, I believe, in the 1970s. And I hope it primes the institution up. There we go. So this is the web address for it, but this is an example of a language that was engineered from the ground up to be unambiguous, meaning that you say exactly what you mean. Now, it's damn near impossible to speak. It's even harder to learn, but it's inspired by predicate logic. And actually, it removes as much ambiguity as possible. So it's actually a perfect language for machine translation of laws, of rules. And there's many different ways you can design languages that remove ambiguity. That's effectively what programming languages are. So when one writes a constitution, the first time you kind of get a sense of an overall community ethos, and then you have to go through the exercise of expressing that in increasingly more rigorous formalism. This is what we did with the Cardano protocol as a whole, where what we did is we took it, wrote it in prose, LaTeX in math, and now it's being translated to AGDA, which actually has a machine executable specification, meaning that there's zero ambiguity from low ambiguity. White papers are moderate ambiguity because the concept of ideal functionality standards have to be set. So just some food to thought, and you have to kind of work your way through it. Life's hard. Conversations are hard. It requires cognitive work to be a thinking person. And liberty requires you to be informed. Freedom requires you to be informed. If you are fully comfortable living in a dictatorship, then you don't have to know anything. You don't have to have an opinion on anything, and you can just let people run your life on autopilot. If you want to live in a free society where your life, liberty, and property is your God-given right, and you're in charge of it, you have to manage it, and you have to have the freedom to make mistakes. You have to have the freedom to be wrong, And you have to put constraints in to prevent people from stealing those things, including the government, from you. It's not always going to be your dad. It's sometimes an adversary. And there have to be checks and balances and rule of law and equal application of that law to everybody. And this is just a great example of where every year our institutions continue to degrade and deteriorate, and it's getting worse. So we have to be better, and we have to grow and evolve if we want to get out of this. And then through that example, we can rebuild systems that are substantially better. Go from don't be evil to can't be evil by design. And it's why blockchain always is going to have a market, because at the end of the day, it's pretty hard to trust people. And the more and more that we can trust to deduction and derivation and the good old dry code of the world, the easier it is to focus on those small things that humans do need to be involved in. So I hope this helps. I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays. Hopefully I'll see you before then, but if I don't, please do enjoy the rest of the year. Cheers, everyone.